I am sure for many who haven't heard the concept before, the title of this may have been a bit shocking to read, but before you scramble to reply with something about social contracts and the like, allow me to explain. If you have ever spoken to a principled libertarian, a voluntarist such as myself, or an anarcho-capitalist, at any point, you will probably have already heard the reasoning as to why taxation is a form of theft. I'd like to quickly go over that reasoning, as well as responding to some of the arguments given against it, and then look at ways in which it isn't. So the reasoning behind the statement is simple. The state claims the right to take a portion of your income. It does this without express permission and with the threat of arrest and confinement or even death, should you defend yourself from it. The taking of your property without your permission, or with the threat or acts of violence, should you not comply, is theft, and because of this, taxation is a form of theft. The first response this usually gets is that it cannot be theft because as a result of taxation, the state then provides you with a variety of services that you have access to. This usually comes pre-packaged with the claim that either only the state can provide that service, or at the least, it can provide it much more efficiently than a free market. The second part of that claim is not relevant to the debate, however, since even if it were the case, it would merely be a justification of theft, as opposed to refuting it. The action doesn't change. An easy example of this would be a starving man stealing food to survive. It is still theft, but many would consider it justified. You can argue that the state in many ways does the exact same thing. The first part, that is the claim that you get something in return, meaning that taxation isn't theft. The flaw, of course, is that this presumes you would agree to the exchange. If I were to steal your car and leave something in its place, I would have still stolen your car. You having received something in the process does not mean that you consented to it. It was not a voluntary exchange. When you consider also that what you get in return in many cases is something that you specifically do not want, more than half of the voters in the UK, for example, voted to leave the European Union. They were all, however, forced to pay for the state to send them what was effectively a book of EU propaganda. They steal from you to fund what you may in fact oppose. This is certainly not a trade many would ever agree to. Another common response to the claim of taxation being theft is that it cannot be so, as we live in something resembling a democracy, and that by voting for the state we consent to be taxed. The first thing to note about this is that many people who could vote don't, and therefore even if voting is consent, nearly half the population, in most cases, didn't consent to it. On top of this, democracy doesn't actually change the action itself. Democratically mandated theft is still theft. There are many valid criticisms of democracy that are worth noting as well, be it as a tyranny of the majority or, in my opinion, more accurately, a tyranny of the plurality, since it's rare that an actual majority is what wins. The criticism here is summed up in a well-known line of questioning that begins with, if John and I vote to take your wallet, and we allow you to vote too, is it theft when we then take your wallet? And is gradually scaled up, asking at what arbitrary point does it become valid? 50 people, 100, 1,000, and so on. Usually the response to this is something along the lines of, democracy isn't perfect, but it's the best we've got. Well, maybe you're right, maybe not, but that does not invalidate any criticism of it. The last thing that people tend to try and say is that we agree to it via a social contract with the state and those around us. This, unfortunately, by its nature as a hypothetical concept with no physical manifestation, makes it entirely unfalsifiable, somewhat akin to claiming that God did it, because you cannot prove otherwise. Even, however, if it is true, it's not a voluntary agreement if you never consent to it. Had it imposed at birth, and you are only released from it when you die, I would not be all that surprised if others may have compared it to enslavement. Forcing someone into an involuntary contract so that you can take money from them would still be theft, even by the state's definition. There is one argument, though, which nobody has ever made directly to me, but which I would make should I play devil's advocate with fellow libertarians. The theft stems from a violation of property rights and of the non-aggression principle. In a video I watched a while ago, the hypothetical scenario of jumping a farmer's fence to escape a bear attack was raised. You wouldn't have time to get permission, but the alternative is getting mauled by a bear. In circumstances like this, you would violate the property rights and jump the fence, under the assumption that the farmer would agree to it should you ask permission in those circumstances. All this requires, then, to no longer be a violation, would be for the farmer to give consent after the fact, and by this reasoning, assuming the individual who paid the tax consents to it afterwards, it would not be theft from them as individuals. This can't unfortunately be applied universally, however, since you would have to presume that everyone would give their consent after the fact. I would also question if you would agree should someone knock on your door to request a large, ever-changing portion of your income and every transaction you make, so that they can then force you to follow their regulations, use their monopolised services that you will forever complain about being inefficient, and wage just enough wars to destabilise entire regions of the planet.